Aston Martin and Fernando Alonso's starring role in the Bahrain Grand Prix was one of the most celebrated stories of the 2023 season opener. But nobody at Red Bull seemed able to comment on that performance without throwing in a barb or two. Imitation is the biggest form of flattery, was team principal Christian Horner's verdict. Sergio Perez said it was nice to see 3 Red Bulls on the podium, while Helmut Marko talked of Red Bull's former head of aero Dan Fallows, now Aston Martin technical director, and a number of other employees moving to the team and having a good memory. He later clarified that these comments were a joke, following that up again by pointing to the similarity of the Aston Martin. A joke those comments may have been, but as the saying goes, many a true word is said in jest. But how true is it to call the Aston Martin AMR23 a Red Bull clone and ascribe its early 2023 success to that? The pink Mercedes. Aston Martin has some form when it comes to copycat cars. In 2020, as Racing Point, it produced the famous pink Mercedes. This was, by the team's own admission, largely a copy of the all-conquering Mercedes W10. The decision was made to drop its existing high-rate concept and do everything it could to replicate the low-rate Mercedes that dominated in 2019. This allowed Racing Point to finish 4th in the Constructors' Championship and win the Sakir Grand Prix with Sergio Perez. This was perfectly legal and achieved by using all of the data it could from photographic sources. There were also suggestions some advanced 3D photography techniques and even scanning of the Mercedes were used. However, there was nothing illegal about the car, save for the Mercedes-designed rear brake ducts, which was the result of the team being caught out by a rule change for 2020 related to listed parts. However, this stirred up controversy about so-called copycat cars and led to a series of rule changes that outlawed combining photos with clever software that could be used to generate CAD data, stereophotogrammetry and associated techniques, surface scanning, and other tools that could allow a car to be reverse engineered. But none of this prevents being inspired by other cars. That's been part of car design since the beginning. After all, you can't design an F1 car without first copying the inventor of the wheel. The Green Red Bull. The 2023 Aston Martin has been dubbed by some a Green Red Bull, and it's fair to say that there is more than a passing resemblance. But how similar is it to the Red Bull RB18 that dominated last season? Our old car, as Horner put it. To understand that, we have to look back almost a year to the Spanish Grand Prix in 2022. There, Aston Martin introduced a major upgrade package that changed from its initial, bulky sidepod design to something that was very Red Bull-esque. This was where the Green Red Bull allegations first surfaced. Dan Fallows, who Red Bull fought to keep before eventually relenting when the pay offer moved into 7 figures, was the obvious connection. Fallows started work in April 2020, so when Aston Martin appeared with a Red Bull-style sidepod in May, it was no surprise that Horner said an internal investigation was ongoing to ensure no impropriety. As he pointed out, any design data used would be a criminal offence. Red Bull ultimately conceded there were no such concerns and life went on, perhaps helped by the fact that Aston Martin was still well off the pace. Aston Martin, for its part, was adamant it had been working on this design concept since long before Fallows was there. Certainly, it would have been unlikely to have turned round such a major design overhaul so quickly after his arrival. Aston Martin didn't make many more significant changes to its car that season, other than a small step at Silverstone and some minor tweaks at other races, but it was inevitable that its 2023 car would build on this direction. So it's no surprise that when it launched its car, it bore a resemblance to last year's Red Bull RB18. The underlying concept is the same, with the Aston Martin having the downwash ramps, aggressive undercut and letterbox cooling inlets in the sidepods that characterised last year's Red Bull. But this is the prevailing concept that to a greater or lesser extent has been used by 7 of the 10 teams this year. So let's take a look at the cars in detail. The nose and front wing of the Aston Martin and the Red Bull may not diverge dramatically, but the treatment of the nose and the shaping of it is clearly different, as is the way it connects to the front wing mainplane. The same can be said of the front wing treatment. There's also a major difference in the front suspension, with Aston Martin running a pushrod configuration and Red Bull running pull rod. This has an impact on the way the airflow is conditioned between the front wing and the front of the sidepods. The cooling inlet at the top of the sidepods is a similar shape but not identical, with the undercut behind it aggressive but exhibiting differences in shape compared to the Red Bull. The same can be said of the downwash ramps, which look very similar from side on in terms of design, but if you look from the top down, it's clear that the Aston Martin design is very different. The Red Bull side pods are more open, but the Aston Martin has a hint of Ferrari, with the rounded edge of its side pods. That means it's containing more of the top surface airflow. A straight copy wouldn't look anything like this, and this is far more dramatic than a small difference in detail. At the rear there's also a suspension difference, with Aston Martin running a pull rod configuration. That's partly because it uses a Mercedes gearbox and rear suspension. Red Bull, by contrast, runs a push rod configuration at the rear. What's more, it's also built around the Mercedes rather than the Honda power units, which inevitably means architectural differences. So while there's a clear similarity in the overall concept, the Aston Martin AMR23 is not simply a clone of the RB18. While the Racing Point of 2020 was almost indistinguishable from the 2019 Mercedes, albeit with a few small differences, the AMR23 is much more different. And those differences are exaggerated when you compare the Aston Martin to this year's evolutionary Red Bull. The Red Bull concept is the one most are following, and Aston Martin has done the same, but there's plenty of evidence of new ideas of its own on top of that. It's effectively doing exactly what has always been done with F1 car design, taking the best of designs produced by rivals and adding your own interpretations and new concepts to it. Aston Martin's ambition. Simply producing a straight copy of last year's Red Bull would not only be illegal given the rule changes that came in for 2021, but undesirable for Aston Martin. It's a rapidly expanding team, one that has grown from 400 people in 2018 to over 700 today, and this is on the brink of moving into a new state-of-the-art facility. Fallows has stressed the importance not just of replicating its big team rivals, but also developing its own ways. Aston Martin certainly has plenty of knowledge from Red Bull, not just from Fallows but also other recruits, and there's nothing wrong with that, as it's only design IP that can't be shared. As Fallows has admitted, he understood the basis of the Red Bull concept from his time with the team. But Aston Martin also has knowledge from other teams. That includes Mercedes, with Deputy Technical Director Eric Blondin, former Mercedes head of aero, on its books. The same applies for most teams given so many employees have come through the doors in recent years. So what is encouraging is that Aston Martin has not simply reproduced what Red Bull did, but also built on it. That's what all good teams in F1 history have done. The key is how deep its understanding of how the car works is. That's what will dictate not only its development rate this year, but also how it progresses in 2024 and 25. As for Red Bull, its chippiness at what Aston Martin is doing suggests the Silverstone-based squad is doing a lot right. Some of that might stem from frustration at being the victim of Aston Martin's aggressive recruitment strategy, but that's exactly how Red Bull made other teams feel in its early days when it was doing exactly the same. That's not just high-profile technical leaders such as Adrian Newey, lured from front-running McLaren, Jeff Willis from Williams and Rob Marshall from Renault, but also the lower-profile rank and file. And it's how Red Bull has made its rival power unit suppliers feel in recent times, with its recruitment for the Red Bull Powertrains division. Mercedes talked in 2021 of staff being approached with lottery number salary offers to leave its Brixworth high-performance powertrains engine base, and Red Bull made no secret of Mercedes being an obvious place to try to attract talent from. There's nothing wrong with Red Bull doing that as it builds up to become an F1 engine supplier, just like Aston Martin has done nothing wrong with its own aggressive recruitment and the design of a car that is much more than a Red Bull copy. Based on current evidence, Aston Martin is advancing more rapidly than expected on its trajectory towards the front. Perhaps that's what Red Bull is most concerned about.